This conference will now be recorded.
All right. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pass it over to our wonderful board president, Judy Wright, just to say a brief hello this morning. Good morning, Judy.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second coffee with NAHRA for 2021. We're excited, as Azadeh said, to have Rick McGee, and our whole goal is to provide everybody resources. So we are fortunate to have so many contacts, and Mr. McGee is one of our best resources for tribal employment law. So I'm going to turn it over to him, and then we can get started. But welcome again.
Judy, thank you very much for the kind words and the introduction. Really appreciate the board, Azadeh and Tal, facilitating this. I very much look forward to the conversation. Really appreciate everyone joining us here this morning. My goal is to help facilitate a conversation. I anticipate and look at the numbers here that we're going to get north of 45 or 50. And for me, that means 45 or 50 experts on the call here with us today. I'll certainly give you my 2 cents. To the extent that I or our team, our entire team of 45 or 50, if we don't have an answer to one of these questions, or if you're not satisfied, I am more than happy to follow up with you after the call and get you the answer or get you the resource that is needed. So I hope that you are well. I hope your families and your colleagues are well, and looking forward to this conversation. So Azadeh is helping us out with the slides. If the slides look nice, she did it. So that first one did look nice. So we've got a couple agenda items here. The first page is, what would you like to discuss? So if you're able to take yourself off mute, or if there's a chat box, if we can get your participation right off the bat here, are there some things that you would like to have a conversation about this morning?
Mr. McGee, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to remind everyone to please mute. There is some significant background noise on some phones, so let's be courteous to all callers and mute so we can hear Mr. McGee loud and clear. Thanks, Rick. Sorry.
You're welcome, Tal. And Tal and Azadeh, how did it go last time with people kind of raising their hand and participating? Is there a good practice there in getting feedback from folks this morning?
The best practice that we have, unfortunately, it doesn't have the raise the hand option unless we can scroll down and see everybody's face. But we do have a chat box on the side of your window. So if you want to go ahead and click the chat box button, see if you guys have any feedback, any questions. Tal and I and Rick will keep an eye on it to see if anybody has any questions. We're super excited to hear from you to see, is there anything that you guys want to discuss?
Azadeh, as we're waiting for that, and feel free to use that chat box. I've got that pulled up. We'll keep an eye on that. If you'd like to verbalize a question, please do that. Azadeh, if you'd like to go to the next slide, I've got another. Oh, you already have the next slide. So it's January of 2021, and I think it's a really good time, especially with this last year, to think about your proactive goals for 2021. And we all recognize in human resources, or if you're not a human resources professional, whatever department head you are, you have a responsibility to be reactive every day. You don't know who's coming through the door today. You don't know what phone call or emails coming in, and part of your job description is to react to those issues that are presented to you. So that's a skill set for all of us. But in addition to that reactive skill set that you all have, how are you going to be proactive in 2021? And in the next slide, we've got some questions for you. Oh, the next slide is me, the facilitator, a little bit of contact information there. I'll be quick about this. like I mentioned, if I don't give you the resources or the answer in today's call, feel free to reach out. Give me a call, give me an email, and happy to do just that. As you know, I've written a couple books in this arena. In 2020, I published 2 more, and so now you know what I was doing with my COVID weekends, and so those books are referenced there. I included some reviews on the next slide, if we can go to the next slide, of 101 Things. So there are 3 reviews here. 101 Things is the best sleeping pill I have had in my medicine closet. That comes from Marianne McGee, that's my mother. I don't think that's a very nice review. The next one, another review for 101 Things is like watching paint dry and grass grow. That's my wife, Denise. I'm not sure that that's a good review either. And then Mother Teresa, she has to be nice to me. She wrote a review that says 101 Things is fantastic if you want kindling for a campfire. I thought that Mother Teresa was a nice woman, but she's not writing very nice reviews of that book. So maybe you shouldn't get that book given those 3 reviews. So a little attempt at humor over GoToMeeting here this morning. Let's move on to our next slide here. And let's just talk a little bit about being proactive. You could spend lots of bucks on a consultant and do some strategic planning. But in my view, if you're doing strategic planning from a human resources department, or if you're the director of another department within a tribal organization, I think there are 6 questions for you to consider. And if you can answer these 6 questions, I think you've got a strategic plan. You have proactive goals for 2021. So let's look at those 6 questions. Then there's one more slide of some respectful recommendations, and then we'll answer any questions from this. But then the chat box is helping us out here. We've got a whole bunch of questions coming in. So this is great, and we really appreciate that. So let's look at these 6 questions. If you were to sit down with let's go back one slide. Yeah, thank you, Azadeh. If you were to sit down with a blank piece of paper and you had no constraints, no money constraints, you could spend as many dollars as you wanted, no people constraint, you could hire as many folks, you could bring in as many resources from other departments. What are the 12, 13, or 14 big goals that would make a meaningful impact in your department in human resources? So that's the first question there. What are the dozen rational and irrational goals for your department? So just spill them down there. Don't worry about priorities. Don't worry about how it's going down on the paper. Just maybe you and a couple trusted colleagues within your department, you're writing down those 10, 12, 14 big goals, and you're not tying that to budget or anything else. The second question on the slide, of those dozen, which 4, and there's nothing magic about 4, but what are the 3, 4, or 5 goals that you can accomplish in the next 18 months? So now we're thinking about June or July of 2022. In the next 18 months, what are the 3, 4, or 5 goals that you can accomplish? So now we've got to think about priorities. You've got 12, 13, 14 big goals. Of those, what can you do? And then, so what resources do you have? And then what are your priorities? Because we can't work on 12 things. I know you're great multitaskers, but we've got to focus on a couple themes. Next, once we get those goals, you've got those 3, 4, or 5 goals. What are the tasks? The next questionnaire, what tasks must be completed to accomplish those goals? So my goal at the ABC Tribe is to hire more of our tribal members. So what are the tasks necessary to get that done? Well, I want to look at our TARO ordinance. Has our TARO ordinance been updated to make sure that we are leveraging the talent within our tribe? That's a task. Who am I going to assign to that? Because I might not be the best person to do that. That's going to be our next question. So in addition to that, maybe we need some additional funds to buy work boots, to do some additional training, to update people's resumes, to help them with interview skills. Those are all tasks to help more of our tribal members become employed in the next year or so. So whatever goal you have, break it into those smaller tasks so you as the leader can identify the tasks necessary and then bring us to the next question. Who in your department or outside your department, maybe it's somebody in finance, maybe it's somebody in maintenance, maybe it's your in-house lawyer, who in your department or outside your department will complete each task? And this is where we see sometimes strategic planning fail within departments, in that we think that we're the right person for all of the tasks. Well, that's not right. You're busy doing a lot of things. So who are you going to ask help get some of this stuff done? Next, the milestones question. Which tasks must be completed at months 3, 6, 9, 12? You know what I'm doing here. We can't, unlike that test we took in 12th grade, we can't study the night before, right? And get a good grade. So we've got to get some stuff done. If we're going to accomplish our 4 or 5 goals in the next 18 months, we've got to get some of these tasks done in the next 3, 6, and 9 months. So what are those milestones? What needs to be done in 3 months so we can accomplish this thing in 18 months, knowing that everything won't go well, that there will be some curveballs? I've seen some clients set this up on Excel spreadsheets, and then they can monitor progress as the project moves along. And then finally, are your department goals aligned with leadership's goal? So Judy, as the Vice President of Human Resources, when she talks to her general manager or her board, are her goals in her department aligned with theirs? If you are on the tribal government side, does tribal council, do they have a strategic plan? And how does your strategic plan within your department fit within theirs? Is it aligned? So in my respectful view, if you're able to answer those 5 or 6 questions, you've got a strategic plan for your department. And I don't want to go there quite yet, but on the next slide, there are some respectful recommendations. But I know there are some folks on this call that do strategic planning. I won't call him or her out here, but does anybody want to add anything? All of you strategic planners out there, do you have any recommendations, anything to add to these 6 questions, or any best practices you'd like to share with the group?
Rick, my brief contribution, very brief, is who will be the champion? And I define champion in strategic planning as the person that will help coordinate, keep the task going, do the calendar invites, gather information. I find that's a very critical step in planning, or it just kind of gets lost day by day, week by week, and then 3 months, 6 months go by, and hey, where are we in the plan? So identify, who is or are your champions to the process. They're not accountable for all the plan itself, but they move it along tactically. Thanks, Rick.
I was hoping that Tal would contribute, because I know how much experience he has with strategic planning, and I could not agree more. And I think about some of my clients that have done this, and they have that person, and it's not necessarily the director, the human resources director, it's someone else that has kind of ownership over that Excel spreadsheet and is doing exactly what Tal talked about, coordinating those efforts, maybe answering some questions, but I think that is a critical piece. Anybody else? You're among friends here. Please don't be bashful.
This is Suzanne. Good morning, everybody. I was just thinking that, maybe a good idea that we could put on the NAHRA website is if anybody wanted to share their past strategic plans, or I know our particular company, we do the annual work plans that is kind of the same concept, but maybe we could have those for our members that you could access to just kind of see what everybody else kind of looks like. So we will see if you want to maybe forward those to Azaday, and we'll put a few of ours on there too, just to give you some examples.
Suzanne, that's a great idea. Very much appreciate that. Anyone else?
No, I also think that's a great idea too, because so many people do it differently, and to have a common template, it would be great. So I think that's a fantastic idea.
Really appreciate that, Judy. And I think if there's one mistake when it comes to strategic planning, it is after the plan is complete. And there are a lot of strategic plans that collect a lot of dust. So those suggestions that were just provided, I think, are awesome in making sure we get to the finish line, because that's the whole goal here. It's not to have some fancy pants strategic plan that collects dust. It's something that will move the needle in being proactive in 2021 and 2022.
I also think that it would be really good to make sure that you remember to get the community's input. When you're prioritizing, sometimes we would do like a Survey Monkey with a lot, let's say we had 20 goals, and we would send it out to the community to condense what they really feel like is important to the community and not just us as employees.
Really appreciate that suggestion as well. And to build on Azade's comment with that survey, I'm working with the tribe right now, and they're doing focus groups, and they're doing focus groups with employees top to bottom in the chain of command. Then they're also doing these focus groups with the community, and the information that has come through, and we didn't get it right the first time, but the information that's come through from the community has been really, really eye-opening and super helpful. So couldn't agree more, Azadeh. Really appreciate that feedback. Let's move on to the next slide, which contains some respectful recommendations. And so there's nothing magic about this, and there's no order here, but I just wanted to generate some conversation with you. In thinking about your strategic plans, what are some of the goals? And if you're willing to share some of the goals that you've had, I think that we would benefit from that. But the first one is something that NAHRA has endorsed for a long time, which is policy is great. Policy and procedure, those are necessary tools that we have, but we want to graduate the black ink on the white paper, the policy and procedure. We also want to make that law, and we don't have to have laws that are as detailed as the policies and procedures. In fact, that's a bad idea. We want to have a law that sets some parameters, kind of sets our compass heading on some things, and then let policy and procedure be more detailed in defining those terms and conditions. There's lots of models out there, and we don't cut and paste, of course, because we want our employment laws to reflect the values, the traditions and customs and goals of specific tribes. But having said that, since there are some models out there, why not look at those as at least a starting point for the conversation? Next, that written consent to handbooks, job descriptions, and department standard operating procedures. I call this the main three. So when it comes to Target and Walmart, our non-native employers, they always get that consent to the employee handbook. I have received a copy of the handbook. I've read the handbook. I love the handbook. And then we get somebody to sign off on that as that day one consent. It's important for Target and Walmart to do that for all the reasons that it's important to get employee consent, but it's 10 times more important for tribal employers to do it because of a 1981 case called Montana versus United States. So, and the other principle is if you didn't get Rick's consent on day one, you can get it tomorrow. So you don't have to reach back or re-employ me. There's nothing magic about this, but you can require all of your present employees, whether they've been there for a day or 11 years, it doesn't matter. You can require them to sign off. I've received a copy, I've read it, I understand it. And the big three for me are the policy and procedure manual, I'm calling it a handbook up there, the employee's job description, and then any departmental policies and procedures. Get your employees to sign off on those things. And then when you have new ones, when you modify and amend those, then think about getting your employees to sign off on the new policy and procedure manual, the new job description, which brings us to the next point, getting those handbooks and job descriptions updated. Enough said. Next point, directors and officers liability insurance. Remember that Lewis v. Clark case, and I don't want to make anybody nervous, but I think that because of Lewis v. Clark, that's our Mohegan Sun limousine driver. Remember, they held him individually liable or legally responsible for the accident. It went to the Supreme Court a couple of years ago. As a result of that case, I'm seeing a little bit more litigation naming individual employees. I've got 2 lawsuits going on right now where I'm defending individual employees sued in tribal court for things that they did as employees. So if that happens, and as a director of human resources, you know, you're kind of out there. Sometimes you're making decisions. People are holding you responsible for that. I'm sure it's not likely you're going to be sued, but just in case, one of the components of insurance is that they will pay for your attorney's fees. And we know those lawyers are expensive. So directors and officers liability insurance, I think, is a good idea. And then to the extent that your organization has it, are you on it? Is your, not your name, but is your title covered under that D&O insurance? Now, every time I have this conversation, I get a call from in-house counsel saying, why are you selling insurance? I'm not selling insurance, I'm selling the idea of insurance. And then they ask me about immunity. Don't you know we have immunity? And I say, yep, I understand that. However, to the extent that that rare thing happens where one of my folks gets sued, I want to make sure we've got some protection there. Next, help directors extend the tribe's training reach. What do we mean by that? I'd like to see your directors and managers more engaged from a training perspective in 2021. We have this training, we have some annual training, you do all those things from a human resources department, but what are your directors and managers doing in their weekly and bi-weekly meetings to further those conversations? So to the extent that we can add an agenda item, just 3 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes on a policy a week. It doesn't have to be very involved. And those directors and managers can do that training themselves or invite you to that conversation. Next, from a goals standpoint, another respectful recommendation, get a seat at the federal grants table. To the extent that we are agreeing to follow federal law and federal grants, there are some opportunities there. This is not a perfect system, but there are times when we can negotiate the terms of those federal grants, especially on the 638 funding side. But if you're not there to raise your hand and say, hey, do we really want to follow all federal employment laws as a condition of receiving this federal money? Probably not. And to the extent that we can negotiate, I think there's an opportunity there in 2021. And then finally, those Bostock decisions, the Supreme Court decided 3 cases a summer and a half ago now. And in those Bostock decisions, Title VII was interpreted to include sexual orientation and gender transition. I felt at the time that we would be having more conversations about the protected class lists at your tribes. So we know that Title VII does not apply to us, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be the best employer on the block or in the county or in the area. And one of the things about being the best employer is to protect the civil rights of our employees. So I'm asking you to go back and look at your pledges of equal employment opportunity. We don't discriminate or harass based on race, religion, national origin, sex or gender, age, pregnancy. What is on your list? And then should you at least consider engaging in the conversation that those Bostock decisions, expanding the definition of Title VII, again, Title VII does not apply to us, but the conversation applies to us. What should be on our protected class list? And then do we have that in our handbooks? Do our forms reflect those protections? Do we have some training on what those things mean when it comes to respecting those traits and characteristics? So some respectful recommendations. I'd like to hit the pause button here and ask you all, do you have any goals in 2021 that you'd like to add to this list?
Rick, I think Tal here, one, and I don't see it in the chat room yet, but with colleagues across Indian country, I don't know if we would call it a goal, but yet HR, we're being asked, how do we recover from COVID? You know, how does that look like a goal? Do we come back up to numbers, pre-layoffs? What's the strategic plan? How does it connect with the executive group and their plan? COVID's at the table, and to the chat room, we'll ask these questions in a few moments, Rick. A lot of this is related to COVID. So I think it's clear that in 2021, it's still in our strategic plan, maybe into 2022, we're told. So just a thought there.
Could not agree more. Thank you, Tal. Anybody else? Hearing none, shall we go to the chat room? And again,
definitely.
Great. If anybody has and wants to verbalize a comment or a question, we certainly have room for that as well.
Really quickly, the first comment came from, it says 9389, Dana. So Dana has a question, and I think this question we could give Dana some advice in the chat box. She is new to her HR department and is looking for suggestions for database systems. So if anybody wants to send either everyone in the group or Dana a direct message at 9389 on the chat box, some suggestions for a database. Otherwise, Dana, I will get you a list, if you can send me your email address, of some of the options that I know of.
Azadeh, I have recorded 2 or 3 questions. Now the time to finish, Rick, is that what you want to do?
Yes, please. Thank you for facilitating that, Azadeh and Tal.
Absolutely. I think the one related to the most relevant or recent slide, there's a question, Mr. Beal, James, the privilege of working with James. Should the acknowledgements on your handbooks, Rick, that you mentioned just a few moments ago, what is your recommendation to a physical signature versus that of electronic signature? So much is electronic these days. What are your thoughts to that? And I think part of the complication is being able to truly prove somebody it's their signature versus this funky little electronic thing. What are your thoughts there, Rick?
So 10 years ago, really appreciate that question, by the way, it's insightful. 10 years ago, the answer was, if you're a small organization, get it in writing. So get that blue ink on that paper and then preserve all of those documents. The courts have really come around and they recognize the value in electronic signatures, but Tal hit on exactly the right issue, which is the courts would call this authentication. And it's a $10 word for the idea. Did Tal Moore actually, did he actually consent to this document? Is that his electronic signature, or did Rick put Tal's electronic signature to that? So we need to, HR needs to team up with IT, and if we had an issue in front of a grievance panel or in front of an unemployment compensation judge or in a courtroom, could we authenticate that Tal Moore actually executed that document? And that testimony would come from an IT professional, likely, that could say, yes, we assigned Tal an email address. The document was transmitted to him on such and such a date. It came back with bearing his electronic signature on such and such a date, and he's the only one that has access to his system. Some testimony to lay a foundation for that process. It sounds complicated, it's not, and it's a very routine thing now in courts. So that electronic signature is important. To the extent you still have paper, that works as well.
I have a question for you, Rick. Sometimes we have in the past, because I'm on the casino side, where 600 of our staff is not on a computer, so an electronic signature is not possible. And with COVID and the challenges that not bringing groups of people together, we've done a lot more Zoom meetings and whatnot. We had language for a sexual harassment training where if they attended that training, that was their agreement and acknowledgement to those rules, or that they had received the handouts, do you think that would, I mean, we just kind of did that on the fly for COVID, but do you think that would hold up in court, that we're using it, we put it on the start of the training, and that if they attend that training, that's their acknowledgement? But I feel like it's a little weak, but I just wondered what your thoughts were on it.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And thank you, Suzanne. It becomes a proof problem from a legal perspective. It's a lot easier for me to prove that Suzanne signed the document saying she was at the training and she stayed awake for that training, right? Whereas now I've got to prove that Suzanne was at the training and she saw the screen and she understood the slide. So it's a little bit more cumbersome, but that kind of consent can still prove consent, or that process can prove consent, but it's a little steeper hill. So then you're looking for an answer to this. So we have to be practical. And if we have a smaller organization and it's not COVID and we can get electronic signatures or paper signatures, that's probably the best possible scenario. But as we move down the risk spectrum and we make it a little bit harder to prove these things, from a practical standpoint, Suzanne's solution can be a solution, but it just carries a little bit more risk at the end of the day that the judge or the grievance panel might not believe what we're saying.
Rick, just another brief add, experience-wise, and this is an entirely different topic, but a tribe I recently worked with allowed OSHA on their property, and they were doing some physical audits, and they encountered electronic signatures and a spreadsheet showing registration, and they said, no, if you don't stop that practice, it will become a citation, because it is no illustration that somebody attended the session and acknowledged their safety. So just experience there. I agree with your risk analysis from the high level why you want a signature to that of a lower level and risk, but just a little experience there. Again, we can talk about OSHA in another coffee. That's a whole nother topic, right? But that's a risk and signature issue. Thanks, Rick.
It's a really good point, Tal. And in THRP training, the Drummond team brings in a lawyer that is awesome in I-9s, and she would probably join Tal in cautioning from an I-9 perspective. If you don't go the electronic route, you want to preserve ink on paper on the non-electronic route. So there are some exceptions to this.
Rick, there are 2 or 3 questions I've recorded specific to COVID, but I see that as your first topic on the slide. So if you're okay with that, we'll hold those questions until you cover that topic. Is that okay, Mr. McGee?
Yeah, thank you, Tal. So first topic here, can employers require employees to get the COVID vaccine? And I did an article on this. I'm happy to share that article with you. In addition to some legal analysis, which I'm going to share here in just a moment, there are some forms in that article. And so we might be able to get that up on the website, very user-friendly forms. I can't take credit for them. I got on a law firm website and extracted those forms, but gave them credit, that law firm, in that article. So the bottom line here is we don't have to require our employees to be vaccinated, but if we decide that it's in our business best interest, the answer is yes, you can. So now let's do a little analysis underneath that, because we can't leave it to be that simple, right? So the answer is yes, you can. But again, if we borrow from the federal system, we know that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, we know those laws do not apply to us. We also know that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which enforces Title VII, they have no jurisdiction over us, generally speaking, because the law that they enforce does not apply. But having said that, The EEOC has issued a guidance that has said employers can require their employees to be vaccinated, especially if you have a business reason. And we can think about good business reasons. From a tribal government, we want to provide excellent services to our members. And if our employees can't be there, it's hard to provide those services. We also want to protect our folks. In addition to casinos, we want to maintain open doors there and make sure that we're able to provide and generate those funds necessary to fund those tribal programs. So there are compelling business reasons for our employees to be vaccinated. So do you require it? And if you do, then again, using the EEOC as a guide, not as a controlling entity, but as a guide, they say that there are at least 2 exceptions that non-native employers should be thinking about. And the forms that I have also focus on these exceptions. Does an employee have a religious-based exception, objection, if you will, from their religion? Can they object to the vaccine? That's question number 1. And then question number 2, does the employee have a medical reason not to be vaccinated? And some of the reading I've been doing talks about people with compromised immune systems, whatever that means medically. So if you have got a compromised immune system, a vaccine might not be best for you. So now for that particular person, we're going to go through a process where they're able to raise their hand, likely come to human resources, fill out a form. We may or may not take their word for it. We may or may not do some due diligence. But to the extent that they've made their case from a medical or religious perspective, they would be exempt. What do we do with that? Well, we continue to be creative. You were all very creative in this last year. Are there teleworking opportunities? Are there opportunities to have them report to work but not interact with their colleagues? Can we give them a new office? Can we physically separate them? Can we require them not to go to the employee cafeteria or the break room? There might be some common sense things that we can do for those employees to keep them employed even though they are not vaccinated. And at some point, I know this term herd immunity has gotten some negative publicity, but at some point, we're hopeful that we're all able to be safe, even though we don't have 100% vaccination. So again, happy to share those forms, and there's some legal analysis there. But any comments or questions?
Stephanie had a question, and she is very related. She said, is there any issues with incentivizing the COVID vaccine?
That's a great question, and we're seeing that in the newspaper now as well. So there's this idea of an incentive where CEOs of large companies, I know United Airlines, their CEO recorded a video and said, "Hey, you should be vaccinated, and here are the reasons why." We're also seeing some companies, I haven't seen any numbers yet, and you may have, giving some bonuses, some financial bonuses. I don't see any legal issues with that. I did see, and I'm glancing to my left here, again, from an EEOC standpoint, again, they do not control, but using them as a guide, they've promulgated some proposed rules for your wellness programs. And there's a court case where when it comes to your wellness program, if you charge people 30% more in insurance, if you didn't go through some wellness process, you didn't go to the health club enough, you didn't get assessed enough, then they would charge you 30% more for healthcare. And the court said, that's crazy. That's way too big of a negative incentive. So we wouldn't want to do this vaccination process within your wellness program. I wouldn't tie it to that, but I'd have it as an independent policy. And I don't see any legal issues with incentives at this point.
And then a follow-up question from Cindy is, if we have an employee who chooses not to receive the vaccine, should we also have them sign a waiver?
So as you can see, I'm hesitating here. So I really like that question. And so yes, my answer is going to be yes to that. However, the waiver isn't worth a lot. And the reason is it's more of an acknowledgement. And I don't want to split hairs I don't have here, right? But to the extent that you have an employee refuse, you absolutely want to document that. So I really like Cindy's suggestion here from a documentation standpoint. When we think about waiver and release, to the extent that an employee is signing a document saying, I waive my rights against my tribe if I ever get the COVID, that's going to be a difficult one to legally support. And I'm not saying that that's what Cindy was arguing or asserting, but I really like the idea of an acknowledgement or documenting the fact that someone's refusing, but the validity of that in protecting you, I think, is relatively minimal. But why not?
I know one of our concerns, because we've been open and we have had employees working, that to now insist, or make it required to get the vaccine, maybe implies that they really weren't as safe as we were telling them they were because of our safety protocols. So because of the masks and the distancing and the plexiglass, we've told them we feel we've created a safe environment for you to be at work. So I worry that if we made vaccinations required now, they would say, well, I thought we were safe.
Suzanne, that's a great point. And the answer that I've provided to that, whether this is a good answer or not, is in the summer of 2020, in July of 2020, we had some tools available to us. And you just identified those tools: masks, social distancing, temperatures, etc. Now we have a new tool. And we're going to add that tool to the toolbox in protecting our organization, our team members. That's the answer I've given so far. And I don't know if that sells.
I like it.
The other thing that Suzanne's comment reminds me of is I went around and around with clients on hazard pay. And I know under some of the funding avenues, hazard pay was an opportunity to pay additional dollars to our folks. And I fully supported that. Some of our team members came to work in very difficult circumstances, especially our healthcare providers, right? So we wanted to get that hazard pay to them. But I'm really nervous about the label hazard pay for exactly the reason that Suzanne just talked about. We've made a promise to our employees that unless they are in a gold mine, and I don't think any of us are mining gold or coal, right? So that we have a safe working environment, free from violence, free from sexual harassment, and free from hazards. So we've made that pledge, but then we're paying our folks hazard pay. So to the extent that that program continues to provide a benefit that is helpful to your team members, I'm not saying get rid of it, but when that possibility, when that avenue kind of dries up from a funding standpoint, I'm asking you to reconsider those hazard pay policies because your workplaces are not hazardous.
A real quick add to that, a tribe that I'm aware of, they don't call it hazard pay as you're recommending not to. So here's the solution they came to. CDC, of course, uses the term essential employees. Well, if we opened up, we're essential to the government, right? So we're revenue, if you're gaming, if you're education. So they called that pay not hazard pay, they called it essential worker pay. And it was temporary in its assignment, just to add on to not just what not to do, but a solution for an idea. That's all.
That's a really smart idea. I wish I had thought about that, Tal. Thank you.
Yeah, I wish I did too. I'm just conveying a best practice.
We had another question from Erica. She had two questions, but the first one was, can an employer terminate their employee who refuses to get vaccinated?
So legally, yes. And We want to do all of our other best practices when it comes to a termination, and we likely will continue to be creative in trying to find solutions for our employees. But as an organization, if you feel that you've got a strong business reason for requiring your employees to be vaccinated, and if you don't, let's say it a different way, my respectful recommendation is to bake in the religious and medical exemptions. But if Rick McGee does not have a good faith religious objection, and if I don't have a medical condition, and I'm just nervous about the vaccine, and I'm refusing, and you don't have another area for me to work, you don't have a creative solution for me, in my view, you can terminate that employee.
And then her follow-up question, sorry, go ahead, Suzanne.
Oh, I just wanted to say, is there any liability or concerns with liability if you make that a requirement of the job and 12 months from now there is an issue with the vaccine? Do you have to be concerned about that?
And that's a great question. And I looked at that and could not find any case law and I don't see anything in the native arena, but I don't see anything in the non-native arena either where employers have been held responsible. Okay. It's typically the manufacturer that is held responsible, but then they also have significant immunity under another federal law as well. But I couldn't find any cases, Suzanne. I don't know if anybody else have had their legal departments look at this, but I couldn't find any cases where employers have been held responsible.
Okay, good.
And Erica's second question was, in your opinion, should the organization mandate all of their employees to get vaccinated?
So the answer we've been given on that is if there's a business reason to. One of the challenges in carving out different departments is we already know Department A is going to be jealous about Department B. Why are you imposing this requirement on me and not on them? And that creates a huge morale issue. So the conversations I've had, we have justified, or we've at least had conversations about justifying the business reason for the organization to be vaccinated in total. But I guess legally, if you don't have a business reason for Department A, but you have a business reason for B, C, and D, fair enough, but then you've got a morale issue probably.
And then jumping on the termination question, Candace had a question. What should the statute of limitations be when looking at terminating an employee for the refusal of the vaccine?
Great question. And my answer is going to be, I don't know, but let me give you a little analysis to I don't know. So let's talk about a statute of limitations. I was driving my car this morning and I knocked Azadeh down and she sustained some medical injuries and she's got banged up and she's going to sue me for knocking her down with my automobile. In Minnesota here, she would have 6 years to sue me. So on the 6th anniversary, if she has not sued me, then I am free of any legal responsibility for knocking Azadeh down with my car. So that's called a statute of limitations, the length of time that someone can sue you for your poor behavior or your breach of contract or whatever. And unfortunately, there are different statutes of limitations for different behaviors. So a breach of contract might be 3 years, whereas a tort like knocking Azadeh down with my car is 6 years. And that varies from state to state. Most tribes don't have ordinances of limitation. Some do. Some tribes have those things. If we think about your employee handbook probably has a deadline to raise an employment issue. So let's say it's 30 days. And so if an employee fails to raise an employment issue within 30 days, and therefore they lose their grievance rights, we might have a defense in court. It's not like a statute of limitations It's called the failure to exhaust administrative remedies. So I didn't go through the grievance process because it was untimely. Therefore, I can't sue. That's one defense in a lawsuit that we would have. So that's indirectly, that could be a statute of limitations, kind of. But in the absence of an ordinance of limitation, I've tried to argue federal statutes of limitations in tribal courts. And on the 2 times, it's only happened twice for me, the courts rejected applying the federal statute. So it's a little bit of an I don't know, and I apologize for that. So maybe there's a respectful recommendation there. Talk to tribal council and get an ordinance that has a 1-year statute in it, a 1-year limitation.
So we had another question from Maylene, and I'm not sure. I know we do have a couple of insurance people on the line, but Maylene had a few individuals who got COVID at work. They're frontline workers, and they filed for workers' compensation and it was denied. The employee ended up dying of complications from COVID, and the insurance company said because COVID is a community disease, they denied the claim. Are other tribes having similar issues, and does anybody have any suggestions or any ideas on how we can work this one out?
I had a conversation with Donald Malloy from Tribal First regarding the workers' comp claims for COVID. And what he had mentioned was that it's very difficult to prove that someone actually contracted the virus at work when it is so, vast out there in the community. You can only make the claim, you can only, put in the workers' comp claim, and then the burden of proof is really on the individual to say that they actually caught it at work. And that's probably why it was denied there.
And Judy, Rick, Ozade, if I can pitch in, I agree with everything Judy just said. I agree with that, and I've been told the same. Many of us in particular states, I know here where I sit in Washington, the health department in this region has been very, very active in tracing. And if they trace it and say it's a cluster source or a trace source at their work site and it's documented, that is, again, burden of proof on the claimant, yes, but there's a documentation now that the health department has put into writing saying that employee caught it because of a cluster source in their employment. I know that's a state-to-state and regional issue, but many of our tribes are now contending with that. The prediction is there's going to be a lot more claims. What happens to those claims, that's up to our insurance companies. And I think that conversation with each of our insurance, whether it's a TPA, the carrier itself, with our risk department included, need to be having those conversations instead of being surprised when we see 10 or 15 or more claims, because it's predicted that's going to occur in many of our workplaces.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Good point.
And to build on that too, from a legal perspective, there is an incentive to let these work comp claims go through. And I don't want to make our insurance people nervous about this, but think about work comp. What's one of the benefits of workers' compensation? In most states, it's a so-called exclusive remedy. So I'll say that one more time. In many states, it's a so-called exclusive remedy, meaning it's the only remedy. And so if I get hurt at work, I can't make a tort claim. I can't sue my employer in court because I've got this exclusive remedy, the only remedy, which is workers' compensation. And under workers' compensation, under a schedule, and again, we want to be super sympathetic to people that have been sick and have lost their lives here. I don't want to be, I don't want to gloss over that at all. That's a really important thing. But through the work comp system, we likely have more limited exposure than we might in the tort system. But then let me wear my other hat, because I have got to argue the other side. On the other side of that, we likely have immunity, because with workers' compensation, we have a limited waiver of sovereign immunity that permits you to go through the workers' comp system. Whereas if I get sued in my tribal court or a federal or state court for a tort claim because I caught COVID at work, that immunity defense is still there, and it likely will be successful. And then that would be zero claim paid. So there's a little bit of a strategic thing here in thinking that through. But Azadeh, Judy, and Tal are 100% right. It comes down to causation. And Tal's right as well, that to the extent that a state agency is able to point to that cluster, that might be enough evidence. I don't know. It comes down to the facts in a particular specific case. Great question.
Rick, we did have a question from Lisa earlier, and she wanted to know, what should employers require to employees to return to work after being home due to COVID?
Really appreciate that question, Lisa. And I'd like to bounce that ball. I'm happy to answer it, but I know that there are folks on the call that have protocols for this. Can I get a little help from folks that have protocols exactly for this question, please?
I know for our casino in our property, we actually just go by what the CDC guidelines are. You know, they're very clear on not requiring a doctor's note to get somebody back at work. So we just go by, you know, when were they tested, what's the exposure period, you know, and the guidelines that CDC puts out there.
We've done the same thing. We completely follow the health authority. So whatever they were told by the health authority, if they were told to quarantine for a certain amount of days and then they can return, we go with that. If they require them to take a test, then we would go with that. We just completely leave it up to what the health authority, and because they provide that in writing, then we get that document from the employee before they return. So we have documentation of them following the guidelines that they were given.
This is Lisa. If I may, we require a doctor's note, basically, that they are okay to return to work, and ask that they, you know, put the date that they're able to return to work. But we're running into a situation where the doctors don't want to do that, or the healthcare providers don't want to do that, and so that's the you know, the conundrum is, do we change the policy so that's no longer required, or do we force the employee to go to a different healthcare provider that will do it, or so thank you for
you know what we did as on our property is we had a deviation from our policy for the COVID, and this was in our pandemic plan, that we would not ask, because that is normally our policy, is that we have some type of release from a doctor or a healthcare provider for any time off. But because of the overload for our healthcare system, we did the deviation to the policy, and we did not require it. That's, again, we followed the CDC. But you know, you also have to look, if someone was hospitalized, then you probably do want to get your healthcare provider there. You're not going to go just by the CDC guidelines or the healthcare or the public health requirements. You know, because so everybody gets it in different. I'm going to say stage, or they get it differently, or it impacts people differently. So people who are hospitalized, they typically come in with some type of release.
You know, if I could jump in on that too, you know, the one thing that has been very apparent through this whole thing, hi everybody, has been, you know, we talk about how, you know, the tribal business is really like a big family business, and that is never more apparent than when you talk about one family member working here testing positive, and it takes out 4 other people now because your wife works here, your daughter works here, your all the people live in the same household, and that quarantine period for each person is different. That has been something that has been really hard. And, the hardest part about this whole thing is you're really dealing with honor system. You're really wanting to make sure that your team members know that you're understanding about the situation, you're caring, things like that, to make sure that people are being transparent with what's going on in their at their household, and quarantine and abilities to quarantine. It has just been, one scenario after another, but just thought I'd add that in there because that's something that's been really challenging with us. Just it is a family business. So.
Really well said, Mike, Lisa, grateful. Judy, really appreciate all that feedback. Let's talk legally about what a potential claim might look like, and then kind of reverse engineer this answer. And I won't belate this, I won't be long, but the cause of action is called negligence. And then negligence starts with the question, do we have a duty to protect our employees? And the answer is yes. And then if we bring them back, when we bring them back, we have to act in a reasonable way. Because if we breach our duty, we're being unreasonable. And as Suzanne and Judy talked about, the CDC, in fact, said early on, don't ask for doctor's notes because the doctors can't keep up. It's like drinking water out of a fire hose. We won't be able to get the doctor's notes and get these people back to work. So we're not going to require that. But Lisa said that her tribe, and Lisa's in-house counsel really appreciate that comment, they require doctor's notes. That's reasonable. So if to the extent that Suzanne and Judy are following the strict guidelines of CDC, that's a reasonable answer. But Lisa said, we're taking one more step when we're requiring a doctor's note. That's also reasonable. So now we've met the reasonable person standard. Do I have a duty to protect? Yes, I do. Am I being reasonable in bringing my folks back? Yes, I am. And it's an objective standard. It's a CDC or it's a healthcare provider. As a result, the employer is not negligent. We could be sued, but we're going to win that case because we're able to demonstrate that what we did was reasonable. The one exception I've seen in this arena, which makes things more complicated, is if you send out FMLA paperwork for your COVID sick employees. And because of your policies that say that the employee can't come back without a medical provider certifying that they're able to perform the essential function of the job, in those cases, we've had a little bit of a dilemma. And I've had clients just waive that requirement for the practical reason that it's going to be hard to get those doctor's notes. I really appreciate everybody's contribution on that answer, and I hope, I don't know who asked that, but credit to the question, and I really appreciate the answers.
I just want to say thank you, Rick, and I do feel bad that we will have to cut this off because I feel like we could probably talk for hours about all of our questions. We will continue to have coffee with NAHRAs. We are scheduling them on the last Wednesday of every month. They're found on our LinkedIn, Facebook, and our website page. So please join us again. And I am very appreciative of everyone's questions. Again, this is recorded, so I will have it on our members only site after I have it updated and probably beautified, add some filters and do some fun things. Just kidding. I don't know how it's going to look when it gets translated into digital, but we'll go ahead and get that done. And if you do have questions, go ahead and send the information for Rick McGee is up on the slide. And it looks like some people are interested in sharing some policies that you may or may not have. If you want to leave your email address, we'll see if we can get some policies sent over to you as well. So thank you guys so much. I will post this slideshow and you guys have a wonderful day.
Thank you all. Great to see you all. Be well.
Thank you, everyone.
Hang in there, everyone. Be healthy. Be healthy.
Stay calm, mask on.
We're here for you. We're here for you.
Hugs to everybody. Social distance love. Love y'all.